The Nexus Academy for Galactic Harmony floated serenely in the void between three-star systems, its crystalline spires catching the light of distant suns like a monument to civilized discourse. Built by the collective wisdom of 47 peaceful species, it stood as the galaxy's premier educational institution for conflict resolution, diplomatic theory, and the fine art of aggressive non-aggression. The Academy's motto, etched in 17 different languages across its main entrance, read, "Violence is the failure of imagination." How delightfully naive. Professor Yunth adjusted his chromatic throat sacs, preparing to address his advanced pacifism seminar. The Valian educator had spent the better part of 3 centuries perfecting the art of de-escalation, his PhD in theoretical harmony hanging proudly beside certifications in emotional neutralization and advanced surrender techniques. His classroom, a perfect circle designed to eliminate hierarchical seating arrangements, buzzed with the gentle hum of universal translators, processing the various chittering, warbling, and melodic tones of 23 different species. Today marked a special occasion. The first human exchange student in the Academy's 400-year history sat cross-legged on a meditation cushion, looking remarkably unremarkable among her exotic classmates. The girl appeared to be in her late teens by human standards, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and wearing the standard Academy robes that somehow managed to look more like a combat uniform on her compact frame. The admissions committee had been quite proud of their progressive decision to include a representative from the infamous warrior species, though they'd naturally assigned her to remedial pacifism courses to help her overcome her unfortunate genetic predisposition toward violence. Today, my dear students, Professor Yunth began, his voice carrying the soothing quality of wind chimes in a gentle breeze, we explore the fundamental principle that all conflict stems from misunderstanding. Violence, as we know, is simply creativity constrained by primitive thinking patterns. The human raised her hand. The gesture alone caused 3 Glixarian students to flinch visibly, their gossamer wings rustling with anxiety. Even the simple act of asserting oneself seemed aggressive when performed by one of those terrifying bipeds from the Sol system. "Yes, our honored human colleague, I was wondering," the girl said, her voice carrying an odd inflection that the translators struggled to interpret as either curiosity or subtle mockery. "What exactly do you do when misunderstanding meets someone who enjoys causing pain for entertainment?" A collective shudder rippled through the classroom. The very concept of deriving pleasure from others' suffering was so foreign to most galactic species that their mental frameworks lacked proper categories for processing it. Professor Yunth's throat sacs shifted to a pale purple, the Valian equivalent of nervous laughter. "An excellent question that demonstrates the precise thinking patterns we must overcome," he replied smoothly. "You see, the notion of beings who cannot be reasoned with is itself a form of violence, intellectual violence against the possibility of understanding." The human's eyebrows performed a small maneuver that somehow conveyed more skepticism than a full dissertation on logical fallacy. "So theoretical sadists are theoretical problems with theoretical solutions." "Precisely," Professor Yunth beamed, missing the dangerous undertone entirely. "Violence is always theoretical until we make it real through our limited perspective." Behind the human, a crystalline named Hex whispered to his study partner, his silicon-based vocal cords producing sounds like wind through cave formations. "Is it just me, or does everything she says sound like she's explaining something to children?" His partner, a floating jellyfish-like being from the Drift Nebula, pulsed agreement through bioluminescent patterns. "I heard humans actually have a word for enjoying others' discomfort. They call it sarcasm, but I think that's just their way of practicing emotional violence." The human seemed to hear this exchange despite its volume, and her mouth curved in what Professor Yunth hopefully interpreted as a meditation smile. "So if someone breaks into your home with weapons and refuses to engage in dialogue, you'd recommend community intervention through collective understanding," Professor Yunth replied without hesitation. "We form a circle, share our emotional truths, and guide the confused individual toward enlightenment through patient demonstration of superior conflict resolution technique." "And if they start shooting while you're forming the circle?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several students began performing emergency breathing exercises taught in their stress management through acceptance course. The concept of projectile weapons being discharged during a healing circle session challenged their fundamental worldview in ways that threatened psychological stability. Violence begets violence, Professor Yinth recited, though his throat sacs had shifted to an alarming shade of green. Those who choose aggression are suffering from a deficit of love and understanding. Our role is to provide both in abundance until their pain transforms into growth. The human nodded slowly, as if filing away this information for some future use that probably violated several galactic peace treaties. Right. And how long does this transformation process usually take? Time is an illusion when we approach conflict with infinite compassion. The professor responded, clearly pleased to steer the conversation toward more comfortable philosophical abstraction. Fascinating, the human murmured, and somehow managed to make the words sound like she was planning something that would require extensive cleanup after. As the seminar continued, Professor Yinth guided his students through a meditation exercise designed to visualize their anger dissolving into universal love. The human participated with suspicious enthusiasm, her breathing patterns perfectly synchronized with the prescribed rhythm, while her expression suggested she was mentally cataloging structural weak points in the classroom's architecture. The other students, meanwhile, began shooting nervous glances in her direction. There was something deeply unsettling about watching a member of the galaxy's most notorious combat species practice advanced pacifism technique. It was like watching a supernova attempt flower arrangement technically impressive, but with an underlying sense that something fundamental was being misapplied. As the session concluded, Professor Yinth assigned homework. Each student must write a 1,000-word essay on transforming your most violent impulse into creative expression. The human accepted this assignment with the same mild interest she'd shown throughout the class, but something in her eyes suggested her essay might require a content warning. Walking toward the exit, she paused at the doorway and turned back to address the room with perfect politeness. Professor, just out of curiosity, has anyone ever tested these theories against actual violent individuals, or are they more of a hypothesis-based curriculum? The question struck the assembled aliens like a meteorite hitting a meditation garden. Here was a being asking about empirical evidence for their most sacred beliefs, treating their entire educational philosophy like it might need field testing. The audacity was breathtaking. Professor Yinth's throat sacs cycled through several concerning colors, before settling on a diplomatic shade of mauve. We find that theoretical understanding eliminates the need for such primitive validation methods. Of course, the human replied, and somehow made it sound like agreement while clearly meaning the exact opposite. Theory is much safer than practice, and with that perfectly innocent observation that felt like a declaration of war, she left the classroom, leaving behind 23 thoroughly unsettled aliens, and one professor who was beginning to suspect that admitting a human to Advanced Pacifism 101 might have been a decision that would require significantly more meditation than originally anticipated. The Academy's cafeteria existed in a state of perpetual serenity, its bioluminescent ceiling panels adjusting to the emotional states of diners to maintain optimal harmony frequency. Conversations flowed like gentle streams around topics of artistic expression, philosophical inquiry, and the proper cultivation of inner peace. It was, by all accounts, the most civilized dining experience in the known galaxy. Naturally, this made it the perfect location for everything to go spectacularly wrong. The human sat alone at a corner table, methodically consuming what appeared to be processed protein cubes, while reading something on a datapad that made her occasionally snort with what might charitably be called amusement. Her isolation wasn't entirely voluntary. 3 separate species had attempted to join her for meals, only to flee after experiencing what they described as aggressive chewing and intimidating eye contact during conversation. Across the cafeteria, a cluster of students huddled around a news feed displaying the latest updates from the Outer Rim territory. The footage showed smoking ruins of what had once been the peaceful research station on Kepler 402b. Its crystalline spires reduced to glittering debris scattered across a crater that still glowed with residual energy signature. The Ravagers struck again, whispered Hex, his crystalline form casting prismatic patterns across the table as he trembled. That's the 4th research facility this month. His dining companion, a butterfly-like Etherian named Bloom, fluttered her gossamer wings nervously. The Council of Worlds keeps insisting they're just acting out due to economic displacement. Surely if we send enough cultural ambassadors, they vaporized the last 3 diplomatic envoys. Interrupted Drift, the jellyfish being's bioluminescent patches pulsing in distressed pattern, along with their ships, and the space station they were docked to. The Ravagers don't seem interested in cultural exchange. The human's datapad made a soft chime, and she glanced up from her reading with an expression that suggested she'd been following their conversation despite being 3 tables away. Her hearing, it seemed, was another unsettling human characteristic that violated several assumptions about baseline sensory limitations. Have you tried asking them nicely to stop? She called out, her voice carrying just enough genuine curiosity to make the question sound helpful rather than mocking. Almost. The students exchanged glances that spoke volumes about the growing gap between their educational theory and galactic reality. Professor Yinth approached their table, his throat sacs cycling through concerned purples as he attempted to project calm authority. The Academy's position remains clear, he announced, though his voice lacked its usual wind chime confidence. The beings you call Ravagers are simply expressing their cultural values through alternative communication methods. Violence is never the answer. It's merely a question we haven't learned to ask correctly. The human had wandered over during this proclamation, carrying her empty meal tray with the casual grace of someone accustomed to moving efficiently through spaces. Alternative communication methods, she repeated thoughtfully. Is that what we're calling planetary genocide these days? Genocide is such an aggressive term, Professor Yinth replied, his educational training kicking in despite obvious discomfort. We prefer involuntary population redistribution with permanent settlement restriction. The humans stared at him for a long moment, and something in her expression suggested she was recalibrating her assessment of galactic intelligence levels downward by several significant degrees. And when they redistribute your population to the afterlife, what's the Academy's recommended response? Strongly worded meditation sessions. Before Professor Yinth could launch into his prepared lecture on transformative grief processing, the cafeteria's emergency alert system activated. Holographic displays materialized throughout the dining area, showing real-time footage from the Academy's external sensors. A fleet of angular predatory vessels had emerged from hyperspace, their weapon systems already charging with ominous energy pattern. The Ravager fleet hung in the void like metallic vultures, their ships bristling with enough firepower to crack planets. Their leader's image appeared on the central display, a reptilian being with scarred hide and cybernetic implants that had long ago replaced whatever capacity for mercy evolution might have originally provided. Peaceful scholars of the Nexus Academy, the Ravager commander announced, his translator rendering his words in a voice like grinding metal. We have come to collect your research data on defensive technology. You will transfer all files immediately, along with any beings possessing advanced technical knowledge. Compliance is optional. Survival depends on entertainment value. The cafeteria erupted into panic. 23 different species began performing their respective cultural responses to mortal terror, which ranged from crystalline shattering sounds to bioluminescent strobing to what appeared to be interpretive dance. Professor Yinth activated the Academy's emergency protocols, which consisted primarily of broadcasting healing frequencies and projecting holographic peace symbols at the approaching fleet. Attention hostile vessels. He transmitted, his voice shaking only slightly. We invoke the Galactic Accord on Educational Sanctuary. This facility is dedicated to learning and growth. We have no weapons, no military value, and no desire for conflict. We invite you to join us in dialogue about your needs and how we might address them through collaborative understanding. The response was immediate, a low-yield plasma burst that vaporized the Academy's main communication array, along with the entire east wing of the philosophy department. The message was clear enough that even the most dedicated pacifist couldn't misinterpret it through creative linguistics. In the aftermath of the explosion, as emergency force fields sealed the breach and automated systems began calculating structural damage, an eerie calm settled over the cafeteria. Students stared at the displays showing Ravager boarding pods launching from the fleet,
their trajectory aimed directly at the Academy's docking bays. "Well," the human said conversationally, "this should be educational." Professor Yinth turned to her with something approaching desperation. "Surely your species has encountered such situations before. What do humans typically do when faced with unreasonable aggression?" The girl considered this question with the same thoughtful attention she'd given his earlier lectures. "Usually, we explain the situation very clearly, using small words and practical demonstrations until everyone understands the new rules." "That sounds wonderfully diplomatic," Professor Yinth said hopefully. "Oh yes," the human agreed, her smile taking on a quality that made several nearby students suddenly remember urgent appointments elsewhere. "We're extremely good at making our point understood." The first Ravager boarding pod struck the Academy's hull with a sound like thunder, followed by the unmistakable whine of industrial cutting equipment. Somewhere in the distance, alarms continued their polite suggestions for orderly evacuation to designated Harmony chambers. "So," the human continued, cracking her knuckles in a gesture that translated universally as preparation for activity, "who wants to learn some practical conflict
resolution?" The Academy's emergency protocols had not been designed with actual emergencies in mind. Soft chimes continued their gentle suggestions for mindful evacuation procedures, while Ravager cutting beams carved through the hull like angry stars. The designated Harmony chambers, it turned out, were little more than meditation rooms with extra cushions, hardly suitable for withstanding beings who considered property damage a form of artistic expression. Professor Yinth stood frozen in the center of the cafeteria, his throat sac cycling through colors that had no names in any peaceful language. Around him, students performed their species' traditional panic responses with impressive dedication to cultural authenticity, but notably little practical value for survival. The human, meanwhile, had begun what appeared to be an impromptu physics lesson using cafeteria furniture. She grabbed a standard-issue meditation chair, lightweight, ergonomically perfect, and completely useless for anything requiring structural integrity, and demonstrated its surprising potential for kinetic energy transfer by reducing it to component parts in under 30 seconds. "Right?" she announced, addressing the terrified aliens with the same casual tone she'd used for asking about theoretical sadists. "First lesson: everything is a weapon if you're sufficiently motivated. Second lesson: motivation is about to walk through that door carrying items designed specifically for ending your existence." Bloom, the butterfly-like Etherian, fluttered her wings in distress. "But violence only breeds more violence. The Academy taught us that aggressive responses create karmic debt cycles." That her philosophical observation was interrupted by an explosion that removed the cafeteria's main entrance, along with most of the walls surrounding it. Through the smoking breach stomped 3 Ravagers, their cybernetic implants gleaming with hostile intent, and their weapons charging with sounds that definitely weren't covered in any Harmony frequency charts. "Peacekeepers," the lead Ravager announced, his voice like metal scraping against bone. "We require your technical databases and any individuals with advanced knowledge. Cooperation will be rewarded with swift termination instead of creative alternative." Professor Yinth stepped forward, his training overriding his survival instincts in a display of courage that would have been admirable if it weren't so utterly doomed. "Welcome, displaced beings. I sense great pain in your emotional core. Perhaps we could explore the root trauma that drives your destructive." The Ravager's response was a stun blast that left the professor twitching on the floor, his throat sacs flickering weakly through the color spectrum like a broken rainbow. The aliens gasped collectively, their worldview cracking like poorly tempered glass. "Fascinating," the human observed, studying the Ravager weaponry with professional interest. "Low-yield neural disruptors, designed for incapacitation rather than immediate termination. They actually want you alive for questioning. That's tactically interesting." The lead Ravager swiveled his scarred head toward her, cybernetic eyes focusing with mechanical precision. "The flesh creature speaks of tactics. Amusing. You will provide entertainment before processing." "Oh, I'm definitely going to provide entertainment," the human agreed cheerfully. Then she turned to address the cowering students with the patience of someone explaining basic mathematics to particularly slow children. "Third lesson: when someone tells you their intentions, believe them. Fourth lesson: response time determines survival rates." With that, she demonstrated practical conflict resolution by grabbing a serving tray and introducing it to the nearest Ravager's facial structure at significant velocity. The result was educational in ways the Academy had never intended. The Ravager staggered backward, green blood streaming from a nose that had been forcibly relocated several centimeters to the right of its original position. His companions raised their weapons, but the human had already moved, flowing between tables with liquid efficiency while maintaining a running commentary. Note the confusion when their initial assessment proves incorrect, she called out, using a fallen chair to vault over a plasma blast that vaporized the spot where she'd been standing. Predators rely on predictable prey response. Deviation from expected behavioral patterns creates tactical hesitation. She landed behind the second Ravager and demonstrated the educational value of pressure points by applying her thumbs to specific locations on his neck. The result was immediate unconsciousness, proving that biology remained consistent across species when sufficient force was applied to critical neural path. Fifth lesson, she continued, appropriating the fallen Ravager's weapon with practiced ease. Adaptation beats specialization when environmental conditions change rapidly. The remaining Ravagers had stopped treating this as entertainment. Their leaders snarled commands in their guttural language while adjusting his weapon settings to more permanent configurations. Unfortunately for him, the human had apparently been paying attention to those adjustments. Hex, she called out to the crystalline student, what's the refractive index of your species' natural form? What? Hex stammered, his prismatic surface reflecting light in panicked patterns. Light bending, the human clarified while dodging another plasma burst. Can you focus energy beams? Understanding dawned across Hex's faceted features. Yes, but that would be participating in violence. It goes against everything we've learned. Consider it applied physics, the human suggested, returning fire with appropriately non-lethal shots that nonetheless convinced the Ravagers to seek cover behind overturned tables. Education through practical demonstration. Hex positioned himself between the human and the Ravagers, his crystalline form catching and redirecting the incoming plasma beams in directions that proved highly inconvenient for their original owners. Bloom joined the impromptu lesson by using her flight capabilities for reconnaissance, calling out Ravager positions with surprising tactical accuracy. Within minutes, the cafeteria had been transformed into an interactive learning environment, where theoretical pacifism met practical necessity. Students who had never conceived of violence found themselves providing support for activities that would have horrified them an hour earlier, while the human coordinated their efforts with the casual competence of someone who had apparently been preparing for this exact scenario her entire life. The final Ravager found himself surrounded by 23 aliens, who had just discovered that survival instincts could override several centuries of cultural conditioning. He looked around at his unconscious companion, at the students whose peaceful nature had been temporarily suspended for educational purposes, and at the human who was examining his weapon with the satisfied expression of someone whose theoretical understanding had just been validated through empirical testing. You know, she said conversationally, your commander mentioned collecting technical knowledge. I think we've just provided a very valuable lesson in applied behavioral modification. The Ravager's cybernetic implants clicked rapidly as he processed this new information about allegedly peaceful species and their surprising capacity for creative problem solving. His expression suggested he was beginning to understand why humans had developed such an interesting reputation throughout the galaxy. The fleet will come, he managed, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Oh, I'm counting on it, the human replied, her smile taking on a quality that made the defeated Ravager suddenly very interested in exploring career alternatives. We've got so much more to teach them. The Ravager fleet hung in space like a collection of metallic tombstones, their commanders presumably wondering why their advance boarding party had failed to report back according to schedule. Standard Ravager protocol called for regular updates every 7 minutes, followed by immediate orbital bombardment if communication ceased. It was a simple, effective system that had served them well across 17 conquered systems. Unfortunately for the Ravagers, they had just encountered the first species in galactic history to treat their educational curriculum as a rough guideline rather than sacred doctrine. Inside the Academy, what had once been Advanced Pacifism 101 had undergone a rapid curriculum revision. The meditation circle had been replaced by what the human cheerfully called tactical positioning exercises, while the breathing techniques now focused on maintaining oxygen flow during high-stress physical activity. Professor Yinth,
recovered from his involuntary demonstration of Ravager's stunning technology, watched his life's work being systematically deconstructed and rebuilt according to principles that violated everything he'd ever believed about civilized behavior. "I still don't understand," he whispered to the human as she helped Drift practice what she called aggressive negotiation postures. "How can violence lead to peace? It defies all logical frameworks." The human paused in her instruction of proper thumb placement for maximum neural disruption. "Professor, what happens when someone threatens your students?" We engage in dialogue to understand their pain," he replied automatically. "And when dialogue fails, we demonstrate superior compassion until they recognize their error. And when they start killing your students anyway." Professor Yint's throat sacs shifted through several uncomfortable colors. We trust in the ultimate triumph of understanding over aggression." The human nodded thoughtfully. "Right. And how many of your students die while you're waiting for understanding to triumph?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud, challenging every assumption that had built the Academy's foundation. Around them, alien students practiced movements that would have been unthinkable hours earlier, their peaceful natures adapting with surprising flexibility to circumstances that required more than theoretical solution. "But if we use violence," Professor Yinth continued desperately, "don't we become like them?" "No," the human replied with surprising gentleness. "Violence to protect the innocent isn't the same as violence for pleasure. The Ravagers enjoy causing pain. We're preventing it. Motivation matters, Professor. Intent matters. Results matter." Before he could formulate a response that preserved his worldview, the Academy's external sensors detected incoming movement. The Ravager fleet was deploying assault shuttles, their sleek forms bristling with enough firepower to reduce the station to constituent atoms. The time for philosophical debate had officially expired. "Attention all students," the human announced, her voice carrying through the internal communication system with calm authority. "Final examination begins now. Remember what we've learned about applied conflict resolution. Hex of the light refraction positions ready." "Affirmative," came the crystalline being's response, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Though I still can't believe I'm saying that." "Bloom reconnaissance patterns established. Wing positions confirmed," the Etherian replied, her earlier fluttering replaced by purposeful movement. "I never thought I'd use my flight skills for anything but artistic expression." Drift are the environmental controls configured for maximum disorientation. Bioluminescent strobing patterns ready, the jellyfish being confirmed. "My ancestors would be horrified at this application of natural defense mechanism." The human's tactical network had transformed the Academy from a center of learning into something far more dangerous, an educational institution that had learned to defend itself. The Ravagers, accustomed to overwhelming helpless civilians, were about to receive an advanced course in the difference between pacifism and passivity. The first wave of assault shuttles docked with precision, their occupants confident in their superior firepower and the Academy's well-documented commitment to non-violence. They entered expecting terrified academics and found instead a carefully orchestrated lesson in practical philosophy. Hex redirected their plasma weapons into feedback loops that overloaded their targeting systems. Bloom coordinated aerial surveillance that turned their numerical advantage into navigational confusion. Drift's strobing patterns disrupted their cybernetic implants, while other students applied newly learned principles of kinetic energy transfer with academic enthusiasm. The second wave of attackers found themselves facing beings who had discovered that survival instincts could coexist with peaceful intentions. The third wave encountered students who had learned to channel their species' natural abilities toward protective rather than purely artistic purposes. By the time the Ravager commander decided to cut his losses and withdraw, the Academy had undergone a fundamental transformation. The meditation cushions remained, but they now surrounded tactical planning area. The harmony frequencies still played, but they were calibrated to mask the sounds of defensive preparations. The philosophy remained intact, but it had evolved to include practical applications of theoretical principles. Professor Yinth found himself standing in the restored cafeteria, watching his students practice what they had decided to call assertive communication technique. The human sat nearby, reviewing tactical reports with the same casual attention she had once given his lectures on theoretical pacifism. I still don't understand how this happened, he admitted. We were dedicated to non-violence. We had centuries of peaceful tradition. The human looked up from her reports, her expression thoughtful. Professor, you were never non-violent. You were just fortunate enough to live in a bubble where violence wasn't necessary. When that bubble popped, you discovered that peace isn't the absence of the capacity for violence. It's the choice not to use that capacity, except when absolutely required. She gestured toward the students, who were laughing as they practiced techniques that would have horrified them that morning. Look at them. They're still the same beings they were yesterday. Still dedicated to learning. Still committed to understanding. Still preferring dialogue to conflict. They've just added some practical skills to their theoretical knowledge. Professor Yinth watched Hex demonstrate light refraction techniques to a group of fascinated younger students, their applications now extending far beyond defensive necessity into realms of pure scientific curiosity. Bloom was teaching aerial reconnaissance, as an advanced form of environmental awareness. Drift had begun incorporating tactical bioluminescence into what he called interpretive communication art. So we're still pacifists? Professor Yinth asked hopefully. More than ever, the human assured him. You're just pacifists, who understand that sometimes peace requires enforcement. The Ravagers won't be bothering anyone else anytime soon, and your students learned they can defend their principles without abandoning them. As if to prove her point, the Academy's communications system chimed with an incoming message from the Galactic Council. The transmission carried news that 17 different systems had reported sudden departures of Ravager fleets, their commanders apparently having lost interest in targeting educational institutions. The humans smiled, expression that somehow managed to be both peaceful and slightly predatory. Funny how quickly word spreads about schools that teach practical philosophy. Professor Yinth found himself smiling back, his throat sacs shifting to colors he had never expected to associate with successful conflict resolution. Around, the academy hummed with the sounds of learning, students discussing advanced tactical theory alongside traditional meditation techniques, comparing notes on applied physics and philosophical implications, debating the ethics of defensive violence with the same passionate intensity they had once reserved for purely theoretical discussions. The galaxy's premier institution of higher learning had evolved, adapting to realities that its founders had never imagined. Violence remained the failure of imagination, but imagination now included scenarios where protecting the peaceful required temporary departures from absolute pacifism. The motto still held true, it had simply expanded to encompass a broader definition of creative solution. And in a small corner of the restored cafeteria, the human who had taught an alien class to throw a punch sat quietly reading. Her presence no longer causing nervous evacuations, but rather attracting curious students, eager to learn more about the practical applications of theoretical knowledge. The galaxy's most notorious warrior species, it turned out, had always understood what the peaceful races were just now discovering. True strength lay not in the ability to cause violence, but in the wisdom to know when violence was necessary to preserve everything worth protecting.